You remember the exact moment the internet arrived in your house. You remember being bored in a way that kids today will never understand. Bored with nothing to do. No phone. No streaming. No algorithm feeding you the next thing to watch. Just you, a summer afternoon, and whatever you could find to do with it. You grew up in the last generation that had a childhood completely offline, and the first generation that had to figure out how to live completely online. You did not get a manual for that transition. Nobody did. And whether you realize it or not, that specific experience of growing up exactly when you did, shaped the way your brain works, the way you handle stress, the way you form relationships, and the way you see yourself in a way that is completely unique to your generation. This is the psychology of people born in the 1990s. People born in the 90s occupy a psychological position that has never existed before in human history. You are old enough to remember life before the internet, and young enough to have grown up with it. Psychologists call this the digital immigrant paradox. You were not born into the digital world, but you arrived so young that you had to learn it fluently. Unlike older generations who adopted technology as adults, you absorbed it during the most formative years of your brain development. And unlike younger generations who never knew anything different, you carry the memory of what life felt like before the noise. This creates a very specific psychological tension that follows 90s people throughout their adult lives. On one side, a deep nostalgia for simplicity, for boredom, for things that were slower and quieter and more real. On the other side, a complete inability to disconnect from the digital world that rewired your brain during adolescence. You want both things simultaneously, and the discomfort of wanting both, of remembering the world before and being unable to return to it, is one of the defining emotional experiences of your generation. To understand why 90s people think and feel the way they do, you need to understand what happened to their brains during 3 specific developmental windows. The first window is early childhood, ages 4 to 10. For most 90s kids, this period happened entirely offline. Research in developmental psychology consistently shows that children who spend significant time in unstructured free play, boredom included, develop stronger problem-solving skills, higher frustration tolerance, and more robust internal emotional regulation than children who have constant digital stimulation. You were bored regularly as a child, and that boredom, which felt like nothing at the time, was actually your brain building the capacity to sit with discomfort, generate your own entertainment, and develop intrinsic motivation. This is why 90s people tend to have a higher tolerance for uncertainty and a stronger ability to work independently than generations raised with constant digital stimulation from birth. The second window is adolescence, ages 11 to 18. This is where it gets complicated. The internet arrived for most 90s kids during their teenage years, exactly when the brain is most sensitive to social information, peer evaluation, and identity formation. MSN Messenger, MySpace, early Facebook, the first camera phones. Suddenly social life had a digital layer, but it was slow enough and limited enough that it did not yet consume everything. You experienced social comparison, but not at the algorithmic scale that defines social media today. You experienced online connection, but you also went home and closed the computer and the connection ended. This created a generation with 1 foot in genuine human connection and 1 foot in digital social dynamics, comfortable in both but fully at home in neither. The third window is early adulthood, ages 18 to 25. This is when smartphones arrived and everything changed permanently. The iPhone launched in 2007. Social media exploded between 2008 and 2012. The 90s generation entered their 20s exactly as the attention economy was being built around them. Unlike older generations who had already formed their adult identities before smartphones, 90s people were still figuring out who they were when the algorithm started telling them who they should be. This is why research consistently shows that 90s millennials report higher rates of anxiety, identity uncertainty, and comparison-based dissatisfaction than generations immediately before or after them. Not because they are weaker, because they absorbed the full impact of the most disruptive technological shift in human history during the exact years when their adult identity was being formed. Understanding the psychological forces that shaped you does not change the past, but it changes how you relate to your present. Here is what the research on 90s adult psychology actually suggests. The first insight is about your relationship with boredom. 90s people are uniquely positioned to benefit from deliberately reclaiming boredom because unlike younger generations, they have a lived memory of what it felt like. Neuroscience research shows that boredom activates the default mode network, the same system responsible for creativity, self-reflection, and problem-solving. When you allow yourself to be genuinely bored without reaching for your phone, you are not wasting time. You are accessing the cognitive state that your childhood brain was built in. Scheduled phone-free time is not a wellness trend for 90s people. It is a return to the operating conditions their brain was originally developed under. The second insight is about comparison. The comparison-based anxiety that 90s people experience is not a personal failure. It is a predictable neurological response to being the first generation exposed to algorithmic social comparison at scale during identity formation. Understanding this shifts the response from shame, "I am too insecure," to recognition, "My brain was conditioned to compare by systems specifically designed to make it do exactly that." That recognition creates space. And in that space, you can begin to consciously choose which comparisons you engage with and which ones you recognize as manufactured. The third insight is the most important. 90s people carry something that no generation before them had and no generation after them will have. The memory of both worlds. You know what connection felt like before likes and followers. You know what boredom felt like before infinite scroll. You know what it meant to be unreachable because you were unreachable every day of your childhood. That knowledge is not nostalgia. It is a blueprint for how to live more intentionally in a world designed to make intentional living as difficult as possible. You did not choose to grow up exactly when you did. Nobody does. But you grew up in the Hinge moment, the last years of one world and the first years of another. And that experience of knowing both is not a burden. It is the rarest kind of perspective, one that most people alive today will never have.